Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Carcanet book launch. My name is Becky. I'm so excited to be here and to be launching The Lascaux Notebooks by Jean-Luc Champeret, edited and translated by Philip Terry. Tonight we're joined by Phil Terry and also by Marina Warner, who you'll know is an award-winning writer, historian and critic. Marina's published many collections, most recently Inventory of a Life Mislaid, which is an unreliable memoir of her childhood in Egypt, came out with HarperCollins in 2021. I'm going to hand over to Marina in a couple of minutes, who will introduce Phil, and we can get the evening going. But there's just a couple of housekeeping things first to run over. So we're going to be together for about an hour tonight, and this is a Zoom webinar, so we can't see you, unfortunately, but there is a chat box which I've posted in, so please do find that, say hello, let us know where you're watching from, and do be sure to set that to everybody so we can all read your messages as well. While Phil is reading, we'll be sharing the text on screen for you to see. You're in control of your screen, so please reconfigure that as you wish. You can make Phil bigger, you can make the text bigger. Any technical problems, just put them in the chat and we'll see what we can do to help. There's going to be a Q&A section later on in the event, so please, any questions you have, again, find that button and ask them, and Marina will put them to Phil. And lastly, I think the last thing to say is thank you so much for being here tonight and for paying your £2. The discount code is already in the chat, but I'll put it in again in a minute. And yeah, and we'll also be getting that in an email tomorrow, so that should be fine. Okay, that's everything from me. I'm so excited for tonight. I think it's going to be really, really nice. And I'm going to hand over to Marina now.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be introducing Philip Terry this evening and talking with him about his new book, The Lascaux Notebooks, a remarkable work of great originality. The earliest marks made by humans on the walls of the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet and others include famous drawings of animals, but also enigmatic, non-figurative patterns. What can these mean? Do they mean anything? Like petroglyphs all over the world from Neolithic times, such signs invite speculation and reverie. For example, the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas argued that the cup and ring symbols on rocks in the Near and Middle East testified to a matriarchal society, goddess-worshipping and egalitarian and freedom-loving. Her vision won thousands of followers. Breaking these codes attracts curious and gifted minds. Remember Michael Vestris, who cracked Linear B, the script of Minoan Crete? And before him, Jean-François Champollion understood that Egyptian hieroglyphs are alphabetic, not only pictorial, and he was therefore able to read Egyptian manuscripts and inscriptions for the first time for millennia. Now we have Philip Terry's translation of the breakthrough work on Ice Age inscription. Philip Terry is a poet with long commitment to encoding and decoding. An earlier work, before this splendid new collection, took him to Gilgamesh. Another great cryptographer was George Smith, who was the first person to read Babylonian cuneiform. Phil recast the ancient myth in his book Dictator, forcing himself within the cramped limits of Globish, the international business language, to remarkable, powerful and terrifying effect. Philip is the leading Oulipian in this country, and the editor of the magnificent anthology of Oulipo works in English and in translation, published by Penguin. Oulipo, just in case some of you there aren't already enthusiastic adepts, means ouvroir de littérature potentielle, that is, workshop for potential literature, and it advocates relying on operations of chance in composing poems, as well as the adoption of constraints on lexicon and form in many ingenious ways, such as leaving out a letter or creating acrostics and anagrams and palindromes, in order to release creative energy and the unexpected, the dreamlike, and often the marvelous potential literature. In the Lascaux Notebooks, Phil has submitted himself again to severe restrictions to translate Ice Age petroglyphs as deciphered in the mid-20th century by a very obscure archaeologist, Jean-Luc Champeret, to proceed to interpret a few baffling hieroglyphs devoid of the grammar and syntax that gives most of us the tools with which to write. Phil has undertaken the task of rendering his avatar's work into various forms of contemporary English over a sustained stretch. Like the Gil Goldberg or Diabelli variations, the spare original materials yield a rich sequence, an exhilarating cascade of poetic virtuosity. Phil, please tell us more about how you have set about rediscovering and revivifying Ice Age poetry.
Hello there. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yeah, I'm guessing so. So hello and welcome, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Marina, and thank you so much to everyone for coming. So I'll begin by reading you a passage drawn from the introduction to the book, which sketches the background to Champeret's life and work briefly. So many of you will be familiar with the cave art or the Pariasal art of Altamira, Peshmerga, Lascaux, and other sites, depicting mostly animals, deer, bison, aurochs, horses, mammoths, and so on. If you're familiar with cave art, you may also be aware that the depictions of animals, whether monochrome or polychrome, are almost invariably accompanied by what archaeologists describe as abstract signs. So these take many forms, but the most familiar are signs resembling spears, sometimes in the sides of animals, dots or series of dots, sometimes marking the entrances and the exits to caves, and other signs resembling upside down V's, and so on. Archaeologists have never agreed on what these signs mean, and increasingly today the consensus is to describe them in abstract terms, which eschew ascribing or suggesting any implied meaning. So Paul G. Byrne speaks for many when he describes this art as a body of markings that cannot be read. Archaeologists agree the signs once meant something, but they argue that in the absence of the original artists who would have been able to reveal the artist's intentions, that any meaning remains lost. When Mario Ruspoli asked André Leroy-Gourhan about the signs, he gave a Gallic shrug and added, if only we could put spoken words to those signs. So the work of Jean-Luc Champeret, a selection of which is brought together in the Lascaux notebooks, takes a very different approach, and combining code breaking, poetry, and imagination helps us to understand what these signs might have meant. We know very little about Champeret, but we know that he worked for the resistance during the Second World War as a code breaker, and we know that he visited the Lascaux caves early on to see if they might be suitable as a resistance hideout. His ruminations on the Lascaux signs he left us in a series of notebooks. The arguments here are not made or advanced at all systematically, but putting it all together, Champeret's propositions relating to what he saw in the caves of Lascaux are along the following lines, or seem to be along these lines. So focusing primarily on the signs that he found there, Champeret at once proposes that these be read as script, so as a primitive form of proto-pictographic writing. And in the notebooks, he proposes meanings that should be attached to each sign. So a row of vertical lines, for example, like this, he proposes might represent spears, or a forest, or hair, or rain. Another sign, an upturned V sign, or rather two such signs, one on top of the other, he says might represent mountains, or huts, or bison. Another frequent sign, a line of dots, might represent people, or faces, or feces, or a journey, or steps, or a path, and so on. Le signe, he remarks at one point, n'est jamais arbitraire. The sign is never arbitrary. Such signs, he argues, could be linked together in sequence to form primitive sentences and to carry or pass on messages. These could be scratched on a stone or on a piece of bark, or they could record a transaction. So the sign for mountains, alongside the sign for journey, might convey that a hunting party had crossed the mountains. A group of signs representing antlers might record the goods handed over in an exchange. In terms of interpreting these signs, this is already a breakthrough. Champeret, however, doesn't stop here. He draws our attention to the frequent 3x3 geometric grids to be found at Lascaux. You can see two of them there beneath the black cow and the so-called nave of Lascaux, these 3x3 highly colored geometric squares. He proposes these grids, in themselves empty of meaning, act as frameworks for the insertion of signs, thereby acquiring and multiplying meanings. And Champeret proposes that over time, these grids of visual marks evolved to form the basis of the first visual and written poetry. So beginning with this proposition, Champeret puts it to the test, not by writing one poem, but by writing several hundred. Typically, this involves filling the grid with signs, translating these signs minimally into French, then writing through this translation several times to create a poem and variants. So to illustrate the method, I'll begin by reading 4 of these grid poems from the notebooks. These ones are from the black notebook, the Carnet Noir. So this first one is Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir 1. Watchman, hut, spear, eye, tree, tree, eye, mist, mountains. The watchman by the hut holds his spear, one eye on the trees, one eye on the mist, the mountains. The watchman sits by the hut, holding his spear erect. He keeps one eye on the trees, one eye on the mist-covered mountains. The watchman sits motionless by the hut, clutching his spear tight. He keeps one eye trained on the swaying trees at the forest's edge. The other eye watches the mist as it rises over the mountains. So Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir 5. Woman, needle, hand. Needle, beads, eyes. Woman, knot, necklace. The woman holds a needle in her hand. She takes the needle and pushes it through the bead's eyes. The woman makes a knot, holds up a necklace. The woman is holding a needle carefully in her hand. Moving the needle slowly, she threads it through the eyes of a row of beads. Holding them up, she ties a knot in the gut string, tries on the new necklace. The woman is holding the bone needle carefully between her finger and thumb. Moving the needle swiftly, she threads it through the eyes of a line of amber beads. She holds them up and ties a knot in the gut string, shows her new necklace to her companions. Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir 10. I, bison, sun, horns, bison, spears, legs, bison, club. The eye of the bison is the sun. The horns of the bison are spears. The legs of the bison are clubs. The eye of the bison is like the bright sun. The horns of the bison are like sharp spears. The legs of the bison are like heavy clubs. The white eye of the black bison is like a star at night. The curved horns of the black bison are like sharp spears. The thick legs of the black bison are like heavy clubs. And Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir, 11. Woman, comb, hair, night, hunters, forest, ear, night, bird. A woman combs her hair. It is night. The hunters are in the forest. She listens and hears the night birds. A woman sits combing her long hair. Night has fallen and the hunting party is still in the forest. She listens and hears only the song of the night owl. A woman sits alone, methodically combing her long, fine hair. Night has long fallen and the morning hunting party have not returned from the forest. She listens out, but hears only the sad song of the night owl. So as well as these three grids, which underpin the poems we've just looked at, Champeret discovered a number of other grids at Lascaux, some smaller, 3x2 grids, for example, some larger, including 4x4 grids. And as you move through the notebooks, you see Champeret beginning to experiment with some of these other grids to create different kinds of poetries. The larger grids, as you might expect, allow Champeret to work on a larger scale, and he uses these to reconstruct Ice Age myths. At other times, he joins together different grids in sequence to create longer narrative effects. So here's one of these longer poems from the Blue Notebook. Here, as with the shorter poems, Champeret writes variants of each stage of the poem. But for simplicity's sake, each stage in this reconstruction is represented just by one single variant. So this is from Boîte Rouge, Carnet Bleu. The hunters have left for the land of the horses, left their huts to take the long track over the mountains to the river valley beyond. Mothers look out anxiously over the hills. Some of them will return as men. Some will return transformed into horses. The hunters have returned as horses. When they cry out, we hear the voices of horses. When they enter the river, we see their horse forms. When they see a big cat, they run like horses. Man, horse, I, wife. Wife, horse, I, horse. I, wife, tears. I, horse, tears. The man horse sits by the fire holding a flute. The people round the fire watch the man horse. When the man horse plays the flute, the people hear the birds, the trees. The man who has become a horse sits on his bottom by the fire and begins his whinnying song. He calls out softly, filling the night air with his song of the far-off land of the horse people, where the lush river valley is protected by high mountains, by dense pine woods, where each day the sun goddess watches over the horses from the peaks. The man who has become a horse sings softly of the far-off land of the horse people, where the grass is thick and plentiful on the wide plain, where the fish are fat and plentiful in the bright river, where the birds are strong and plentiful in the clear sky. Man, horse, song, horse, goat, goat, grass, grass, bear, bear, forest, night, cat, cat, bush, bush. The man horse sings of the land of the horses, where the sky is a necklace of fire, where the shadows of the bison at dawn are as long as the river, where the mammoths are as tall as mountains. The man who is now changed into horse form enters the dark and narrow tunnel that leads into the heart of the cave. By the flickering light of a lamp, he sees the great charging bulls, the glossy bulk of the bison, the light-footed reindeer sketched in outline. By the flickering light of a lamp, he makes out the brightly coloured forms of horses galloping across the vertiginous walls of the cave. He looks in wonder and with longing at the horses flying overhead. He neighs, then neighs again, listening to his echo as it fades in the darkness. The horse man accompanies the hunters on an expedition into the Black Mountains. The hunters are following the tracks of a herd of reindeer through the pines. When they see the reindeer at rest amongst the trees, the hunters hurl their sharp spears. Later, when they get back to the village, they look about, but can see no trace of the horseman who has vanished like the light. So to round up this first part, I'll read you two more of the shorter poems from the Black Notebook. The first is one of many riddles that you find there. The second, a kind of domestic poem. So Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir, 89. Woman, black, night. Woman, mountains, mountains. Woman, eye, needle. She is black as the night. She is as large as the mountains. She fits through the eye of a needle. She is black as the darkest night. She is as large as a mountain range, yet she fits through the eye of a needle. She is as black as the darkness of the night. She is as large as the tall black mountains, yet she fits through the slender eye of a needle of bone. And Boîte Noire, Carnet Noir, 12. Tooth, fruit, hut, man, tooth, root, tooth, fruit, happiness. Eaten, the fruit in the hut. You will have to eat a root. Eating the fruit, happiness. I have eaten the fruit kept in the hut. You will have to make do with roots. Eating the fruit, I thought, how delicious. To say, I have eaten the fruit that you were keeping in the hut. You will have to make do with roots when you break fast. Eating the fruit, I thought, how delicious, how cold.
Thank you so much, Phil. I must say you've absolutely conjured, especially in your reading, a kind of whole a world of imagination in your imagination. I was reminded a little when the book first arrived of something that Borges was very interested in, which is that you can create worlds with the imagination and they might even take over reality. Do you think that this is something that echoes with you, Borges's idea of the figment being more real than the real?
The figment being more than the real than the real. It's certainly there are echoes with Borges here, and that confusion of the Clon Ukbar Orbis Tertius. There's a sort of fantastical world created in books, but gradually it starts to take over reality. And I would think also of the Yellow Rose, a late short piece where he describes a poet writing a poem about a yellow rose, and on as he's dying, he has a sort of vision in which he thinks he suddenly realizes that the rose he thought was describing a rose that existed in the world was, rather than describing the world, was adding something new to the world. And that sort of cusp between writing that describes something that's really there and writing which is actually adding something that wasn't there before. I certainly would see some echoes of that in the Champéret poems.
Yes, and the way that you've detailed it so carefully with the notebooks, the boxes, his life, the detail about him, looking, doing reconnaissance on the cave to see if it could be used for the resistance. All these things make him tremendously real. I'm sure a lot of people will Google him.
Okay. Well, I mean, there was a book I'm aware of by a member of Oulipo, Paul Furel, who wrote a novel a few years ago in which he invented an American beat poet. And I don't think there was any, he was never pretending it was more than a fiction, but he invented a story for this poet, but also fills the novel with sort of French versions of beat poetry. And he went so far as to construct Wikipedia pages for this character, which I don't think you'll find for Champéret quite yet.
Perhaps not yet, but perhaps there will be one.
We will see.
Yes. How much did you actually feel about this sort of prehistorical time before you embarked on this collection? I mean, did you feel there was an Ice Age exhibition? Do you remember? Well, there was a wonderful object, one of the earliest sort of objects in the world, of a lion made out of a tooth.
Yes, and I was at that exhibition, and I certainly remember some remarkable objects. I mean, when researching this book, I've found some, things that are almost unbelievable that came from that time. So there were flutes made out of bone on a pentatonic scale and things like this. And there's a place called L'Abri du Cap Blanc, which is quite near Lascaux, a little rock shelter. And in this, there are these fantastic, like sort of bas-relief sculptures. And they're sculptures of mainly deer, but it's a huge thing. It's, you know, reminiscent of something like the Parthenon friezes, and and it's designed so that when the sun comes up in the morning and then goes down in the evening, it changes the position of the heads of the deer, so they appear to rise at one point, and then as it comes to the evening, they fall. So they're not just beautiful sculptures, but they're using the light and the environment to create these almost proto-cinematic effects. So to imagine that there were stories and myths and songs and poetry in this culture was seems entirely logical to me. It's also the hunter-gatherer way of life was sort of enviable in some ways, in that it only took about 2 or 3 hours a day to go out and hunt and gather your food. So the rest of the time, people had enormous amounts of leisure time, which is actually why they started making these artifacts and had time for these remarkable paintings, which are so well known, of course.
Were you interested or somehow by the kind of turn towards, you know, the distant, it's obviously not as distant as Ice Age, but to the Beowulf time, or to the, you know, sort of Heaney's interest in Beowulf, his translation of Beowulf, and also the bog people that inspired some of his poems. I mean, it seems to me there's a slight affinity with, you know, how much these mysterious, deep time places can still speak to us.
Yeah, no, certainly. I read a lot of contemporary writing, but I've always been drawn to reading medieval texts and even earlier texts. Chaucer and Dante have always been favourites for me. And then I got interested in Gilgamesh, as you mentioned earlier, and did a kind of versioning of that, recasting it in Globish, a kind of modern business language. But I don't know. So I've always been drawn to ancient literatures, as so many people have, partly for themselves, partly that in visiting these strange ancient texts, you visit an other place that is very different from where you inhabit, and you can come back from it enriched as if you'd visited another country. But I think there are still, for contemporary writers, things to learn from some of these very old forms that still have resonance in a way. So I found myself being drawn ever backwards in time towards these places, or this place with Ice Age poetry, which we don't quite know whether it exists or not. But what we do know is that there were these signs, and the signs are very real. And what we do know is that the signs once meant something, but today, if you listen to contemporary archaeologists, on the whole, they will take the view that you can't possibly interpret these signs because the people who made them are no longer here. So there's almost an injunction from archaeology saying, no, you cannot go there, you cannot imagine these signs. So you need to have a figure like Champeret, who was there before the archaeologists got there, as it were, to be able to begin to think these signs.
It's interesting.
Think what they might have been. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. No, I just wondered if, you know how a poet like Yeats needed a medium to go through. He needed to sort of triangulate his thought through another person. I think Leo Africanus was one of the people who appeared to him and helped him to write Byzantium. And I wondered if Champeret was a necessary focus for you to feel yourself into the Ice Age?
No, absolutely. So, I mean, the origin of this book for me is it's in a novel by Andrei Cadrescu called The Poetry Lesson, and it's a novel that, in fact, you first lent me, Marina, back in the day when you were still at Essex many years ago. And in the novel, Cadrescu, it's called The Poetry Lesson. It's a novel about an American professor giving a poetry class, and it's a very entertaining but also very informative book about how you might teach poetry. But in that book, he gives his students two set books. One of them is Poems for the Millennium, edited by Rothenberg and Joris, which I have, and which is a magnificent anthology. The other one is a world anthology of Bronze and Stone Age poetry. So immediately I Googled it to get hold of it, to find that it didn't exist. But that got me thinking, actually, maybe there is poetry from Bronze Age and from Stone Age and from the Ice Age. And in a way, at that point, I started looking for traces of this. And the traces of this I found in precisely in these signs at Lascaux, but we somehow didn't know what they were and weren't allowed to interpret them. So if you're going to move forward from that point, you have to find or invent a lens through which you can interpret them, which is where Champeret comes in, because Champeret is there before the archaeologists get there, when the caves are discovered. He's also there before Saussure arrives and tells us about the arbitrariness of the sign. And if the sign is arbitrary, you can't interpret these signs, because you need the sign and the signifier to have some resemblance. If you're going to take a sign in a cave that looks like an arrow, you've got to say that is an arrow. Whereas if the sign is arbitrary, it's harder to do that. So you've got to forget Saussure for a minute. And Champeret was a kind of vehicle through which that could happen, I suppose.
And what's very striking about the poems is what you've managed to achieve through these small means. I mean, they're like trigrams from the I Ching, the ones in a 3x3 grid, and the permutations produces these very rich visual and sensuous effects. And you've written quite a lot about the uses of language in your essay, What is Poetry? Mm-hmm. And two things I think are very interesting about, relevant to this book. One, you say that, you quote T.S. Eliot saying that poetry aspires, every breakthrough in poetry aspires to the condition of common speech. And I don't know if and the other, you say that you predict that the poetry that is both rough and uncharged belongs to the future of poetry. So there's sort of two things there. One, the imitation of common speech. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting in the days in these days of, the internet and so forth, the contraction of speech that you actually produce these wonderful effects with, mm-hmm. and then this idea that the rough and uncharged belongs to the future of poetry.
Yeah, well, that little sort of tiny little thoughts, it's barely an essay, but as you say, called what is poetry. In a way, what that's trying to do is, if there's a sense in which poetry sometimes defamiliarizes the world, that was trying to defamiliarize what it is we think poetry is. So I suppose with Eliot, every revolution in poetry is apt to be, and sometimes announces itself to be, a return to common speech. I think that's very true, and I would agree with that. I think the exception, which I mentioned there, is Mallarmé, whose revolution seems to be a retreat from common speech. But I think I'd be with the common speech side of that, with anti-poetry even, rather than the hermeticism of Mallarmé. So for me, I'd be on the side of people like William Carlos Williams over Pound, perhaps. On the other hand, if you think of the New York school, which has been hugely important to me, they find a way of mixing common speech with very poetic language, which can add other colours. And I think that leaves interesting possibilities open. With the, I think when I was saying something about rough and uncharged poetry belonging to the future, I mean, two very common definitions of poetry, of course, are that poetry is highly charged and polished. So highly charged on the one hand, but also very polished on the other. So language at its dressed up in its finery. So in Milton or Pope, say, you'll get very highly charged language, but also very polished language. And I think I was just trying to say the opposite of that. Why can't poetry be uncharged? Why can't poetry be unpolished? So if you think of an example of unpolished poetry, maybe, so Emily Dickinson's envelope poems, which are absolutely marvelous things. They're highly charged, even if they're very fragmentary, but they're very unpolished. And if you think of, and there are some other poets who seem to be not particularly highly charged. I would think of people like Jacques Prévert, whose poems are, it's pretty, they don't go all the way across the page, so they look like poems, but there's very little rhyme, and it just sounds like somebody talking sometimes. I mean, they're beautiful things in their own way, but they're not especially charged. So I can think of examples of the uncharged and the unpolished, but I can't think of an example of something which is both uncharged and unpolished. I'm sure there are people in our audience who can, and that led me to say the uncharged and the unpolished perhaps belongs to the future. But in a way, I'm just trying to think of directions in which poetry hasn't gone that it might go. Poetry is always changing. I hesitate to say evolving, and that's really what I'm thinking about there.
Do read some more. Would you like to read some more?
Well, there was one other piece I was going to read, which is a kind of, if I can find it. This is a sort of etiological story, and it's this one's in prose. This also comes from the grids and the signs put together, and there are shorter verse-like versions of this which lead to the final one in prose. But I'm just reading you the final version in prose, which is the most elaborated one. You don't see the signs here, but this also is conjured out of the signs. So from Boîte Rouge, Feuille détachée. Once there were only the black bears and the red reindeer on the earth. The black bears spent all their time in the dark of the pine forests, living off honey and insects. The red reindeer spent all their time on the rolling plain, grazing on the long grass and the spiky young leaves of the juniper bushes. Then one day the bears, who had been watching the reindeer from the forest borders, came down from the dark forest to see what it was like where the reindeer lived. And so the bears and the reindeer began to live side by side on the plain, playing together by the river and in and out of the bushes and running round the great boulders which lay strewn across the valley. And as they continued to live together, playing by the river and in and out of the bushes and running round the great boulders which lay strewn across the valley, bit by bit, the strength of the bear, its might and its woolly coat, mingled with the defences of the reindeer, its great rack of antlers and its speed over the ground to make a new creature, the mammoth, which was part like the bear, part like the reindeer, and part like the great boulders round which they loved to play.
Wonderful. Well, there actually are some questions. So I think I'll go. Phil, is that all right? Shall I go to the questions?
Why not? That sounds
Yes.
excellent.
So Ruth Wiggins asks or says, I found your use of the bracketed very effective, Phil. The way you nod to
Bracketed.
question mark.
Mhm.
The way you nod to the provisional and speculative. Could you talk a little more about your strategies, perhaps as an extension of your previous comments on managing the arbitrary versus the deliberate?
Gosh. I think I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I think you're alluding to the fact that some of the poems, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, there are perhaps things in square brackets with question marks, and there are deleted words and so on, and alternative words given. I mean, the idea is that these poems come from notebooks, and that the notebooks are not entirely legible. So there will be gaps, there will be confusions, there will be mess, there will be illegibility, and so the bits in brackets are trying to capture that in a way.
But I think she's also asking a bit more about your methods. I mean, for example, the use of repetition, which is tremendously effective, and the permutations of the words. I mean, did you work those out, as it were, mathematically, that they would, I mean, did you do the permutations very deliberately, or is it more to do with the sound?
Okay, so the permutations, I mean, the crucial step in turning the signs into poems is the discovery of these grids, and the idea that you can put the signs in the grids. And when trying to make these poems, that was the breakthrough moment. And in a way, you've got to learn to trust in the grid. So the grid itself, it's what Oulipo would call a form of combinatory literature. So you combine different signs in the grid, and then you kind of read them off into a poem. So the I, bison, sun, the eye of the bison is the sun. So in a way, it's learning to trust in that process. So it's a little bit like the I Ching, where you might throw down your coins, and it will give you a certain number of coordinates about princes going on a journey and the night coming fast, or whatever it is that's thrown up. These grids with the signs will throw up different permutations and different coordinates, and then writing the poem is kind of running through that, or writing through that. So there's a certain element of control involved, if you like. So perhaps, putting I, and then putting bison, and then putting sun. There's a certain deliberate construction there to get the eye of the bison is like the sun, and then you can go on from there to say the leg of the bison is like a club, or what have you. On the other hand, you can leave it to chance, as John Cage might have done, and just say, okay, what happens if we throw down 9 different signs, or even 9 signs that are the same, into this grid? How can we read that? And then you have to trust in the grid and see what it throws up. So you're giving yourself to the grid. So there are elements of control perhaps involved in this process, but there are also elements of chance and elements of simply allowing the grid to take over and following it. I think that's the best I can explain that, but that's quite accurate to the process. And then of course there comes up the ones I've read, you go from left to right and top to bottom, which is the way we're used to reading. But of course, in the history of poetry, as was made particularly clear to me in a book by Michel Metai called Wild Swans Returning, which is an anthology of reversible Chinese poetry, which can be read in all sorts of directions. You can You can also read these sign grids of the 9 signs from Lascaux. You could read them in different directions, from right to left, but also from left to right, from top to bottom, but also from bottom to top. And all of these things give you different, perhaps arbitrary permutations of the same grid. And you can, if you trust in that and follow it, it can lead to other solutions or other stories or poems.
There's another question here from Lisa Kelly. It's very interesting how the signs can be interpreted in different ways depending on context. This is very similar to British Sign Language. 2 hands making upturned V could be home or mountain, for example. Do you think these poems could have been signed originally?
That's a very interesting thought that certainly hadn't occurred to me, but it's why not? I can absolutely imagine that, and perhaps, yes. I mean, I mentioned these signs being taken from the cave walls and perhaps scratched in sand on the earth or scratched on a stone. But perhaps I think that's a marvelous thought, that the signs might also be things you could sign or make with your hands. I mean, one of the things you get in caves very frequently, of course, is it's not in Lascaux, but it's in Peshmerga, among other places. It's the sign of the hand, and you get these negative hands where one of the ways of painting was to fill your mouth with paint and blow it onto the wall. So if you spit the paint over your hand on the wall, you're left with a negative hand imprint, and that hand is somehow hovers between representation and a sign. But the idea that this, I think, yeah, that's a marvelous idea. I'm sure that's absolutely a possibility and a really interesting thought.
Well, Ruth Wiggins, by the way, is very glad of your answer. She says, great and generous answer, thank you. Now, Susie Hammond asks, could Philip please clarify whether Champerret's role as a linguist recorded the symbols as they appear in the Lascaux grids, and or as a code breaker, then interpreted them as he saw fit? Are the variations Philip presented his extrapolations or Champerret's?
Well, Champeret is assigning, as I said earlier, assigning meanings to each of the signs, and that's a poetic interpretation. So it's got to be, it's a work of the imagination. It's a leap in the dark. It's guesswork. So a sign that was a sign that's a little bit like how we would draw, a child would draw a star, and he's making the obvious association of that. So that could be star, or that could be sun, or it looks a bit like this, like a hand, or that could be fire. So it's guesswork.
One of the things that I felt, listening to you in particular, the way you deliver them, is how close it is to charms and to spells. There's a kind of the use of repetition, yes, and the use of variation somehow gives it an amuletic quality.
Yes, they are like spells, and I think some of them came out as riddles. I don't think there are any that are spells, but riddles can be quite close to spells, and there's certainly I'd agree there's a spell-like element to them, actually. I mean, one strange thing that happened recently in the sort of material history of this book was that a consignment of books went missing. A consignment of Carcanet books, not just this one, went missing in transit, which seemed very strange. I told the poet and critic Rod Mengen from Cambridge this, and he responded along the lines of, bloody hell, did you translate an ancient curse? So this idea that the book itself might be cursed for having revealed an ancient secret or an ancient curse,
yes.
As it sort of hovers in the background here. And I think it made me think that maybe some of these things shouldn't be revealed. And maybe these grids, these 3x3 grids, which I showed you earlier, one of the extraordinary things about these grids are the colors they use, because they're done in colors that appear nowhere else in the cave, and which are very, rare in art of this time. So one of the squares in one of the caves is purple, which is almost unknown at this time. And it made me think that these squares were certainly very special things, perhaps sacred things that we shouldn't be tampering with or talking about. So I hope there are no more calamities around the corner.
You must write another defensive spell. Simon Everett asks, or says, fantastic reading. My question is, presumably we don't know how these hieroglyphs sounded when read, or even if they ever formed a spoken language. I wonder if you might be able to expand on how mindful you were of how the poems would sound in English when you were translating. Did you have an idea of pacing, sonic quality of the poems when you composed the lines?
Thank you, Simon, for that puzzling question. I think the poems took on a sonic quality, and they took on certain shapes that were determined by the kind of line length that could be developed out of 3 signs, which is the most frequent line, and that in itself controlled the line. So you're never going to end up with a line if you're working with signs and a grid of 3 by 3, though that's just one of them, and there are bigger ones, as I mentioned. But if you stick to the 3 by 3, it's very difficult. It's quite a tight form. So if you're translating that, you're never going to get a poem that is like a Walt Whitman poem with these very long, meandering, exuberant lines. It's going to be quite a short thing. So it's going to be like a lyric poem, and so it's going to sound more like William Carlos Williams than it's going to sound like Walt Whitman on the whole. So that in itself brings with it a sort of sonic environment, I would say. Was there another part to Simon's question?
He said you only need to answer it if you want, he says.
Okay, I think I've answered the bit I can answer. Whether or not we know what these, of course, we don't know what these signs would have sounded like, or even if they were spoken. But I think what we can guess is that they represent something. And I remember once talking to Simon actually about Chinese bone script, which in some of those signs there are V's which represent mountains, and that's something. Those V signs are also something you get in these caves. So there are certainly resonances with other ancient scripts where we know what or can guess what was represented, but what it sounds like is something that is lost.
Did you use the full range of signs that we know are inscribed on the caves?
Beg your pardon, Marina?
Did you use the full range of the signs that we know are inscribed on the caves?
There's, well, I suppose yes and no. There's in the Champéret, in the book, there's an index with all the signs from the Champéret notebooks and there are quite a lot of them. I can't remember how many, but over 50. And let me see. There are 70 that are used, but there are also others. There are a few more. I mean, the problem is nobody actually knows how many signs there are, because the parts of the cave walls are almost illegible, and parts of them are defaced, and then occasionally with the drawings you get palimpsests of drawing upon drawing upon drawing, and sign upon sign upon sign, and so actually working out what's there is almost impossible. And different archaeologists at different points in time will argue for differing numbers of cave paintings, even, let alone signs, which are even more numerous. So we don't know how many signs there are, but we know there are a great many, and this uses some of the more obvious. This uses most of them,
yes,
but not quite all of them. So there's a cave near there's a cave near Sheffield where you have the only Ice Age art in Britain, which are some birds' heads carved in the rock. And in this particular cave at Creswell Crags, there were people like Paul Duban will go along and say that there's a finite number of carvings here, and it's not that many according to him. I can't remember, between 10 and 20. Whereas some Spanish archaeologists who went to the same thing saw over 100 representations in the same cave. So different people will disagree, and you see things at different times and in different lights and this sort of thing. And then modern technologies can enhance what's seen in a photograph and take things out. And we're starting to see in the most recent books about Lascaux that there are many more animal drawings than we thought they were, and sometimes one is concealed behind or inside another, and so on and so forth. So the putting a number on it is impossible.
Yes, no.
From what I know about it.
Well, Lisa Kelly has added, it would be great to have an event with these poems signed while you read.
That would be fantastic. I'd love to do that if we can arrange that.
Yes,
Please get
very
in
good.
touch. We should try that sometime. That would be a marvelous thing.
Well, do you want to finish with a poem? Would you like to finish? Because we're just over the hour.
Finish with a poem.
Very nice. I think maybe the poem that you told me had a kind of definite echo of William Carlos Williams.
I've read that one.
Oh, sorry.
There's another one that echoes William Carlos Williams. Here it is. Yes, I found it. As if by miracle, the book opened on the page. It's towards the end. Okay, we haven't got an image of this one, so you'll just have to listen to it. But it's right near the end of the book, and you can't see the images, but I can give you the verbal translations of the images, which are as follows: eyes, bison, 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 rain, rain, bird, bison, bird. We are looking out for bison, looking for bison in the rain, amidst the birds. We watch out for the red bison on which we depend. Watch out for the glistening pelts in the rain among the white birds. So much depends upon the red bison from the hills, their pelts glazed with rainwater in the evening sun, surrounded by the white birds of the air.
Wonderful.
I'll say no more.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, everyone.
There are a lot of wonderful comments in the chat, so maybe Becky can keep it for you.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
That would be fabulous. I haven't had time to look in the chat.
Lots and lots of very warm comments.
Yeah, don't worry. So we'll keep the chat open for a few minutes afterwards so that you can read all of the comments. But yeah, thank you both so much. This has been a really, really wonderful evening. I loved hearing those poems, Phil, and your conversation and questions were amazing. Really, really interesting stuff. Yeah, so I'm going to leave the chat open, as I say, and the recording will be available afterwards, Susie. And yes, thank you all so much for being here and for coming along. And please do join us next week. We're launching Helen Tukey's collection in the Quaker Hotel with Sean Hewitt, same time, same place.